Welcome to the XY Advisor Podcast, a global community of financial advisors sharing and learning with one another to drive the positive evolution of financial advice. To get involved, go to xyadvisor.com or simply download the XY Advisor app. Hub24 is on a mission to empower advisors to deliver better financial futures for their clients. They are dedicated to customer service excellence and delivering innovative product solutions that create value for advisors and their clients. These are just some of the reasons why advisors rate them number one for overall satisfaction and why their managed portfolio solution has been rated best in market 5 years running. Hub24 believes nothing happens in isolation. So they're working together with advisors, licensees, and industry leaders to leverage their data and technology expertise to help solve key challenges in the delivery of financial advice, so more Australians can access cost-effective advice. Welcome back to the XY Advisor Podcast. I'm Fraser Jack, and today I'm joined by Neil Younger. G'day, Neil.
G'day, Fraser. How are you?
Fantastic. Thank you for coming along. Now you're, of course, what do we call you then? The managing director of Fortnum. Tell us about Fortnum.
Yeah, well, Fortnum's a financial services licensee business. Today we look after around 230 advisors across 95 practices across the country. The business itself was founded in 2010 by a gentleman called Ray Miles, and I guess we fit into what is affectionately termed the mid-tier of licensee businesses in the market nowadays.
Yeah, fantastic. And we'll explore a little bit more about that and how that's all working a little bit later. But before we go there, I just wanted to go back in time. Tell us about your journey into financial services and how you sort of fell into this industry.
Yeah, I think we all fall in one way, shape or form, don't we? I found myself falling into AMP as the first organisation that I worked for, originally from Queensland, and it was in Queensland when they used to have big state offices, the Gold Tower, as it used to be affectionately called, in Eagle Street in Brisbane, was my first job. And literally I was out of uni and didn't really even know who AMP was, but they offered me a job and it seemed like a good place to work. It was a large insurance company and that was my first exposure to financial services. Then, of course, the world changed a lot. We moved from life insurance companies, big state offices, into head offices in Sydney or Melbourne, and I moved on from AMP. Probably I think 12, 13 years later, I moved to a company that was then called Seal Corp. That became known as Asgard Wealth Solution, which was the wealth arm of St. George Bank. And I spent probably best part of 10 years with that group, including some of that time as part of the BT group, because Westpac, of course, bought St. George Bank and the wealth business got subsumed into BT. So yeah, I had a fair amount of time there. During that period, I moved from Queensland to Sydney. I moved really to get my first opportunity running a large licensee business, and that one was Securitor, which was, of course, the brand that sat within Asgard Wealth Solution. When the BT merger occurred, I picked up all the BT advice businesses as well, and then from there had a stepping stone into CBA. Career counsellor, it must have been, said to me, "You really need to have a big salary business under your belt." That was a 700 planner salaried channel, so it ticked the big box, and I did that for 12 months. They were right in the middle of a fairly large scale remediation program. It wasn't necessarily what I was signing up for, and I got approached to come and run all the advice and then subsequently distribution businesses across at ANZ. So I spent the following 5 years or so of my career doing that. So that sort of took a long time with a lot of big institutional brands. And so the move into Fortnum from there was kind of a very different step from large senior executive roles to running Fortnum, which at the time had only 100 financial advisors, but had all the, I think, essential ingredients for what I could see was emerging in terms of the next phase of advice and how it would operate in this market. So I was happy to step out of the bank, and certainly I think my decision has been vindicated in terms of being right around where the growth, if you like, in advice segments was going to actually happen.
Yeah, fantastic. No, you're right. It's sort of a journey around the block, if you like, sort of 3 out of the big 4. Well, let's say with 4 out of the big 5, really, to be fair.
Yeah, well, that's right. I did quite a bit of work over the years with Jeff Lloyd, who was at NAB MLC, of course, and he used to joke with me, I've got the only card that you don't have in your wallet. So yeah, I never have worked for National Australia Bank, but I worked for the others, yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. And tell me that, like working for a big business like, say, the CBAs of the world, or when you're looking after huge sort of numbers of advisors, I guess it's probably a little bit different now because you get to know every single advisor intimately and personally, whereas in the past it's probably a little bit difficult to know who everybody is in the big organisation.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that happens is that you're quite far removed from the everyday. There's a number of operating business layers between you and the end advisor. You still get the opportunity to form relationships with advisors, and I certainly worked actively to do so, but not to the same degree. You can't possibly know the numbers that you're dealing with. I mean, my time at ANZ, there was 1,500 advisors in that sort of cohort. That's a big group to have that sort of close and personal relationship with. So yes, moving into the Fortnum world, and that's far more possible. But even that said, we have staff that have day-to-day roles of engaging with advisors and helping them with their practices and so forth. I'm not so involved in that hands-on stuff, but certainly I would have spoken to everybody in the group.
Yeah, exactly. Now we're talking, there's lots of different things to talk to you about. One of the things is obviously change, and you've seen a fair amount of that over your time. And if we go back, if we even go back to, say, when you're in the AMP days, I think that's probably when financial services reform came in, and all this thing that we know as under the Corporations Act now sort of came in. Tell us about that moment.
Oh, well, it was a different time, right? I remember being there when cars were introduced, not the ones that you drive, but customer advice records. And that was the early phases, if you like, of transitioning from what was the life insurance agent structure into financial advice. And almost it felt like the shingle went up, the different shingle went up overnight. A lot of work had to be done underneath the surface of that, but the model very much changed with FSR. That agency relationship, where primary responsibility was owed to the company, turned to being about know your client and doing the right thing by that client. And I think was the early stages of starting to separate product and advice. But it took a while, I think probably fair to say, until we've gone through things like the Royal Commission, where we've really seen that the two can't fit together in the way that the industry constructed them in the past.
Yeah, exactly right. Certainly it's been a large ship that's been turning over a long period of time. And obviously there's a lot of change and gone with that, and the old customer advice record and the customer information brochures and all these sort of types of acronyms changed, of course, along the way. You did, as you mentioned before, you did some work in the banks, and obviously there was some remediation stuff that you mentioned. ASIC came through with their report and pointed the finger squarely at advice being not performing very well. That must have been a tough thing to have to try and work through for, with all the planners.
Yeah, it was hard. The first major program of work was 515, which really set a new set of expectations around what the level of advice accountability looked like. And also compelled organisations, particularly the banks, to look back at prior practice and reconcile the differences. And that was both time-consuming and difficult, but also expensive to rectify sometimes things that were not right, sometimes for expediency things that maybe were right. to get it to the requisite sort of standard. I think probably fair to say it was that piece of work, together with the Royal Commission, that was the death knell for the bank's desire to be involved in the advice businesses in the way that they were, particularly in the area of housing self-employed advisors, where the revenue generated from advice was in the practice and the risk associated with getting it wrong was at a very deep set of pockets at the centre.
Yeah, I sort of relate this back to the obviously, that we've all seen how this played out, right? We know the banks left. I always wonder with the FASEA and the difference between FASEA saying the advice provider is the human, whereas the Corps Act obviously says the company's responsible for the advice provided. So therefore, the directors and those people working in the company are responsible. And I guess that was just, like you said, the writing on the wall for all the changes that took place in the ownership structure of licensing. Talk to us about how that sort of played out from all these businesses now moving around with licensing, and is that settled now, or are we still looking at a lot of changes?
I think we're probably in a lull period before we'll see another re-emergence of the next round of activity, is my sense of where we're at. So obviously in big flurry of activity as the banks made their decisions. CBA, of course, closed the doors on FinWiz, transferred Count Out. Securitor, again, doors closed. So a lot of people dislocated, have to find new homes, a lot of scrambling around, a lot of feeding frenzy from the remaining participants in the marketplace, offering all sorts of deals, if you like, to secure the transitioning advisors. So I think most of that has happened. And of course, you've had NAB MLC more recently and IWF and a feeding frenzy around those advisors. Maybe there's another round of it with AMP going on as well. But I think that's sort of coming to an end. People are set for a little bit. And now I think they get to step back and say, well, is this business partner I've got around licensing, the things that I would like a license to help me do within my business, the right one? And am I getting the right level of value for the payment, particularly as any sort of that short-term discounting that we saw quite a bit of across the marketplace starts to dissipate. So I think we're in a lull, but I do think we'll see another round of activity as people kind of reset whether they made the right choice first time. We're also seeing still a fair bit of activity in businesses kind of right-sizing still, just making sure that the advisors they're working with are the right advisors to be working with if you're the licensee, and vice versa. So it's being done both ways, and that there's the requisite risk management and governance sort of sitting into those businesses. We're still seeing a number of planners exit out of mainstream into their own AFSLs. And listen, to be frank, and it's not just self-serving that I would say this, I am concerned about what that might look for many into the future.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and we can get into the future stuff in a second. I just want to go back a step as well with with Fortnum and its journey through. Obviously, you were following that. Yeah. You've got to keep an eye on all the other licensees as they're coming through, and obviously you would have relationships with all of most of the people running those licensees. Tell us about the journey that Fortnum took on since Ray started in 2010.
So I mean, it was formed out of a group of advisors that had operated together under a license for some time. In some cases, many back to AP days, that an old business that Ray ran. So that was the foundational group that got together. They were like-minded. They were looking for a community of like-minded advisors. They were clear about what they wanted support with, and the infrastructure was built to deliver that to them. What I really came in to do was to take the business through the next phase of its growth, which was take it from that business through a corporatization journey to, a business that was the right size with the requisite scale and capability, which needed to be deeper. And it wasn't deeper because of any lack of desire, just it has to be resourced appropriately to do that, and you need to be bigger. than what it was at the time. So with my corporate background, I had a fair bit of experience around what were the ingredients that needed to position us for the future. And I think the first phase of that was really putting in place the right governance frameworks, the right oversight infrastructure with our advisors, and the right capacity to better support them and then resource that appropriately. I think that's what then happened was that positioned us extremely well when the banks chose to exit. Because for a lot of advisors, they could see there was a stark difference between those that had the capability and those that didn't. And often that reflected in the price. So for many of them, they were well supported in the institutional groups they were a part of before. Even though they might have been frustrated with those institutional groups, they still got a lot of service-related support. The worst scenario, I think, for many of them was to move out of that world, be unsupported, and not know where to go from there. So we ticked a lot of boxes for a number of planner practices that were looking for, an intensive support process, a full service shop, so to speak, and we benefited from that. So we saw a lot of growth, and we saw growth in our target market segment, which was for larger corporatized firms. And that's really been the juncture of our growth over the last period of time. And of course, as you keep getting bigger, you add more to your kit bag and your capability, and you deepen those services further. And that's the nice position that we find ourselves in today. But we're by no means done, right? We're not finished yet.
Yeah, well, and certainly there's always a journey ahead. Talk to us about the changing revenue models in licensing, because obviously there was, we come from a world where there was some subsidization depending on products, and there was some support involved, whether it's educational support or all these types of things, and how that's now changed and what that's done for licensing.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt the model, certainly the models in the banks that I was a part of, were heavily subsidised. The P&Ls of the businesses ran to a loss, and they were topped up with capital to meet their requirements on an annual basis. The only way that could be done, or the only reason that an organisation would have a commercial interest, is because they're making revenue somewhere else, and as we know, that was in the product line. I think the reality is that as the disconnect between the product and the advice became more real, or the risk associated with the advice relative to the revenue attached to the product became differentiated, I think the writing, as we've said, was on the wall. Now, you have to wind out all of what were those subsidies to get to a commercially sustainable business. So in the old days, of course, way back, you used to share the revenue on platforms at licensees level. Well, that's been gone for some time. So you've seen a move very strongly to a fee for service arrangement with the planners that are part of your network, the same as they've moved to a fee-for-service arrangement with their clients. And that's no different for Fortnum's journey. Probably the journey wasn't so big for us because we had less of that revenue because we were not a product manufacturer built into our original business. We had some volume-related overrides, but they were minimal by comparison to the fees that we were generating directly out of our advisors. In fact, if I reflect on the history, it's probably the reason why Fortnum found growing to the degree that it can today harder, because we were just so much more expensive than everyone because we weren't being subsidised. So the playing field's a lot more even nowadays, as essentially, in my view, a number of others have been forced to catch up to that.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously you need numbers to make it viable. And then it becomes a tipping point, I guess.
A lot of fixed costs in these businesses, and in terms of the governance frameworks, the infrastructure, and so forth. They're not inexpensive to run. And I also think licensees get criticised for spending a lot of money that they shouldn't need to spend on compliance, for example. Having been through the process of engaging with the regulator in circumstances where you're deemed to have got it wrong, trust me, it's a worthwhile investment.
Yes, exactly right. Looking back is always once the event's already taken place, it's very easy to point fingers and say, well, that, could have been fixed up. But at the time, you've got to be thinking forward, right?
Correct.
Now, talk to us about the optimum size, because I'm going to get to the advice business in a second, but the optimum size of a licensee, because you mentioned sort of, growing to that right size, that right business right size. What do you think it is for a licensee?
Yeah, so it's funny. When I first joined Fortnum, I thought an optimal size for Fortnum was sort of circa 400 advisors, around 200 practices was kind of I don't want to say back of the envelope, but you kind of have a view in your mind about what makes economic sense as you project forward. And that was a number I had in my head. I don't think I've moved away from that number, but where I've probably varied my view is the number of practices versus the number of advisors. So in Fortnum today, we have about 2.5 advisors for every practice. Which by industry standards at a licensee sort of above 200, that's a pretty good ratio. But I think that will continue to get larger. And we're seeing that with consolidation of practices, the removal of a lot of smaller advisory practices where there may have only been one advisor to a far more practice level corporatized structure. And that's certainly how we've positioned. So I've become less fixed on numbers and more fixed on the revenue profile of the business and the service proposition we can deliver to larger businesses is really, I think, the pathway for our continued growth. But if you ask me for a number, I still say, look, it's probably still that 400 advisors, but maybe it's now 150 practices.
Yep, and it's, of course, built on a whole lot of experience of running different size licensees. Talk to me about this corporatized structure of the practice, because I think it's a really interesting point for a lot of the listeners of this show. If they're a one-person business, then is that less attractive from a licensee, from working with and partnering with a licensee versus if they were to join two or three smaller individual practices together to create that corporate business?
Yeah, look, I think the analogy I use when I get asked questions like this is I say, well, if you're a one person band and you set up a business, if you did an org chart and you said, here's all the roles and responsibilities that fit on that org chart, I've got one name to stick in every box, right? Well, the reality is it's pretty hard for you to be effective in every single one of those boxes. I'm head of marketing, I'm head of planning, paraplanning, I'm head of everything, CFO. It's really difficult. So the reality is that as you get bigger, you can find yourself being able to put multiple names in those boxes in the org chart. And I think that affords you the opportunity to get better at executing each of those individual tasks and better as an organisation as a result. So I do think there is value to scale that comes out of a business getting larger and having within it more functional capabilities. And that's so when I talk about corporatization, the last thing I want people to think about is it being a bureaucracy. There's a reason I don't work for a bank today. I know what bureaucracy is, right? It's not about that, but it's about structure and the discipline that comes with running a business. And I do think there is a difference between being a self-employed financial advisor than being a person that's part of a financial planning business, and that corporatization is a pathway to extracting that value. And I think if I look at it then through a risk lens, I say, well, to do everything that a planner is required to do today, tick every box is going to keep them safe. It's a big job, right? To do that all themselves is risky. To have an infrastructure with the appropriate level of capability and expertise, I think is just becoming more of a necessary ticket to the game. And that's why I think a lot of licensees have started to move away from, the one person band, if you like, that kind of stereotypical shingle. But because maybe they just don't have the capacity to do everything that they need to do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And with regards to the size or the level of that practice, if we were to start a new practice today from scratch with no, nothing in place, what would the target be? What would the target of amount? Is it four advisors, or is it? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, if I look at it down through a revenue lens, I'd say you've got to be aiming at a $3 million revenue line. And I think then you start to say, well, in terms of capacity to service that revenue at a planner level, how many planners do I need, right? I think the reality there we're seeing is that the average client that advisors are dealing with are higher in value because the costs are so high for the delivery of the advice. So the numbers of clients per planner are coming down, and the revenue profile therefore per planner is able to increase. But for a $3 million business, you are talking about 4, probably 5 advisors attached to a business of that size. Now, I will, I don't want to offend people when I say this, because often you do. That doesn't mean that you can't run a successful business with $1 million worth of revenue. It doesn't. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I'm responding to, what I sense is kind of the optimized or the business model that is becoming more prevalent in the marketplace as businesses go through consolidation phases. And I think that number's a realistic one to at least draw a line in the sand, put it on the table.
I think it's a really interesting conversation because it actually does form someone's future view of how they might want to mold their business over time. And obviously business valuations are a big part of that conversation. And so if that $3 million revenue with, is an attractive business for licensing, it's probably also attractive for their business valuation.
I see this a lot in valuation conversations. If I think back 10 years ago, the only metrics you wanted to understand was what was recurring revenue and how many clients do you have, right? They were pretty much the two metrics. Now the DD is far more detailed, right? What's the service proposition? What's the value you're capturing per client? What's the service to variant levels of revenue attached to clients? So the detailed understanding. What's the risk governance frameworks? What's the checks and balances that are put in place? So very much you've got a corporatized view of valuation being applied to the acquisitions because it's just not an aggregation model anymore. So if your business can't answer those questions, then by default, you're going to have less sitting on the other side of that transaction.
Yeah, it's certainly the old days of selling your business based on multiple of revenue. That's surely that's gone by now.
Yeah, I mean, still people back solve against that, but I've seen a massive change in mindset over the last couple of years where people really are looking for the value attributes and more a traditional valuation methodology where they're applying synergistic values to the underlying calculations as opposed to just looking at revenue, one lever.
Yep. Yeah. How do you see data or structured data playing a part in the valuations?
Critical. How well you know your business is critical. How that data is secured. And what intelligence you can extract off that data, I think, is probably the next phase that I'm not sure we've really monetized yet, but we will monetize it. But if you can't produce detailed records on your business and understanding of the economics that drive client interactions and profitability, and then you're on the back foot.
Yep. Yeah. Talk to us about, and probably off the back of that data conversation, how has compliance changed over that time and where is it going in the future?
Yeah. So, compliance traditionally has been reactive. Of course, the main weapon in the compliance arsenal was audit. I think the reality is if you're relying exclusively on audit as a function to meet your supervision and management obligations, then you're probably going to fall short. So data is a critical component to real time or at least preemptive type supervision and monitoring, and businesses like ourselves do a lot of that. We have centralized databases, we have KRIs attached to that database information, and we use it to inform. Now, we don't use it because we want to find that somebody's done something wrong. We use it to make sure organisationally we identify issues before they become, raging bushfires that you can't put out.
Yeah, exactly. And the key risk indicators can certainly do that. So that's, I guess, the idea of, again, looking back and looking now, how can technology or compliance evolve to the space where it's actually helping advisors provide advice before the advice is provided.
Yeah, I think there's quite a bit of progress in that area. Just take breach reporting, for example. Most recently, it's just changed. The new regs have come in October. There's so many mapped outcomes that trigger a breach notification under the new rules as it maps back against Corps Act obligations. They in themselves are too onerous for any single advisor to kind of check balance that. So how do you use technology and embed, if you like, that workflow where it identifies proactively whether if I do this, I probably will get to the end of the journey and realize I've got something that I'm going to have to breach on, right? Prevention rather than cure becomes the mindset. So businesses like us are investing and continue to invest in that type of capability to help ensure that that essentially it's a digital checklist rather than a paper-based checklist, but it's integrated into the process. One of the real challenges we have, which is being frank about this, is that everyone likes to do everything their own way. So it's in some regard, there's not a lot of value in terms of unique differentiators for compliance. So I'm not sure that's necessary to really be thinking that way. But, the more you can homogenise some of these processes, the more you can be pretty clear that they're safe.
Yep. And would you consider compliance, just probably the last one on compliance, to be one of the main services of a licensee?
Oh, absolutely. Like I think if I think about the work effort in our business to synthesise consent, DDO, breach reporting and so forth, if that was done across the 95 odd practices in our business with the requisite legal advice to make sure they've got everything right, it's just would have spent a fortune, right? It's overwhelming as it is when it's distilled down into what do you actually have to do. So absolutely, I think it's a critical component, but it's the foundation component for what you build a business on. When I talk to good businesses, they don't worry about compliance. That's what we have to do as part of our job. And that's the mindset we enjoy working with. It's not something we're imposing upon you. It's something we have to deal. It's a ticket to the game to do the job the way it needs to be done. And then it's now about making that as efficient as possible as it integrates into the process. It's not the enemy. It's just part of the requirements.
Yep. I don't have any evidence of this, but I sort of feel like the licensing is being the middle's being taken out, and we're going to end up with self-licensed, small practices, or we're going to end up with these, the larger groups like yourself. Let's say 300-400 advisors or a couple of hundred practices.
I think there's a danger to that, right? I see this in terms of some of the rhetoric in more recent times. Licensees are the ones that are creating the impost around compliance and governance. I think certainly in the institutional world, your risk tolerance level, particularly as you're going through Royal Commission and 515, is quite low. So they did set the bar relatively low, and they said everyone's got to jump over that. I think that led to a lot of perception that they created the problem. Their response probably did in some regard, but I'm not sure that's necessarily the case for what remains in the sector today. In fact, to the very point I made before, making people do the same task we've just done at a licensee level 90 times has to be more inefficient than having it done once, right? And therefore cost should reflect that in how businesses operate. What I worry about with the way you've described the polarisation occurring is that, one, you could end up with a very homogenised model at the big end, and that's not where we certainly will go. And you could end up with a lot of people just missing the mark at the other end. And not because they're deliberate about it, but just because they just won't have the requisite expertise or scale to get these things done efficiently. And some of them will adopt an I'm out of sight, out of mind approach and just not do them. And I do worry, based upon, as an industry, how much work we've had to do to prove, for many people, they didn't need to prove professionalism and that they did care about their clients firstly. I don't want to find ourselves going through the second phase of that because people have let themselves down with regard to their obligations. And that's what I do get concerned about for the future. And again, it's not necessarily out of intent. It's just they'll not have the expertise.
Yeah, just the sheer amount of things that need to be, or tick boxes that need to be ticked and things that need to be done.
Yeah. Well, I just know how much I invest in those things. and I worry about how they can get to them without being significantly distracted away from the other areas of that org design that I talked about before. They could be focusing their time and energies on for a better return.
Yep. Now that probably leads us into the professional indemnity conversation. Yep. You've obviously seen some changes over the years with the PI insurance. Talk to us about where it's come from, where it's going, and what the prospects are looking forward with PI.
Yeah, it's been hard. The PI insurers got very nervous with claims or potential claims through that 515 phase, and whilst a lot of that remediation was related to fee for no service, that didn't itself create a PI claimable event, refunding unpaid, unserviced fees. The costs associated with the remediation program certainly are claimable. So I think the Australian market insurance got very nervous about that. Parallel that to where a lot of capacity was provided to Australia was out of organisations like Lloyd's of London. And they were going through their own changes structurally within that market. They were limiting capacity around insurance, and you end up with this, the worst of all worlds, as a lack of supply, nervousness about those that are supplying, and the consequence was exclusions, reduction in the quality of the cover, and significant increases in the price point. So, standing start, the conversations for most groups is 30% up on premiums, even environments where you've had no claims. So,
and that tends to be 30% every year. What seems
it is, and I think that's probably going to continue for a little while longer. But we're starting to see, when I talk with our brokers, and we have a composition of Australian and international insurers on our panel, and we're starting to see some interest emerging now back in the UK around insurers. So I think we're starting to see the early stages of maybe that pendulum might swing back a little bit, but it's been a painful experience. And I think, there's certain pockets that have felt that more than others. As I said, for an organisation like ourselves, our claims experience is exceptionally good. Our risk and governance, we can demonstrate in a lot of detail. It gives insurers a lot of comfort. The less you can do of those things, the more difficult it is. And I was in the UK on PI only 2 years ago. It's probably just before we couldn't travel anymore. And there were plenty of war stories from the Londoners about people jumping on planes to come in begging for insurance, otherwise their license was gone.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So, the fact that you need it, and then we only ended up with a couple left? Is that where we got to?
Yeah, you pretty much have had no insurer in the Australian market taking on new business, which means it's going from musical chairs, and it's stopped, and you're sitting in the same seat, right? So you're getting what you're getting as far as an increase is concerned. There are pockets that are getting insured, and I think there's a bit of false security around this because some of the smaller AFSLs are picking up insurance. The insurance is being framed on a low perception of risk because their businesses are small, right? Where I think the danger here is that one claim and they won't get renewal terms because the claim relative to the premium will knock them out. And that's where I think there's some short-term disturbances in the model that will probably wash their way through in the next little while.
Yeah, fantastic. It'd be good to see it coming back towards the centre. I think
and making sure we've got the right levels of cover, I think, Fraser's critical, right? Because, not all covers are equal. And you only know that sometimes when you go to claim. And we've got compensation scheme of last resort coming into bear, and that just creates a burden on the system for everyone else to cover.
Yeah, exactly right. Now, and you're absolutely right about the reading the policy documents because, sometimes the policy wording makes a big difference, and we all know that, but we don't read them. How does the independent conversation come into with licensing? Obviously, there's it's been predominantly most people just stay away from the term because it's easier than trying to work it out. Has it ever been something that you guys looked at or considered?
Yeah, it's hard because, say, for example, life insurance commission, which is still a legitimate way to be charging for services in the insurance space. The moment you have that, you can't pass that independence test, right? So on the basis of that alone, we've never sought to push that path. Actually, in mind the update to the legislative requirement where you can disclose, well, I'm not independent, but define why. Because I'm not sure you're necessarily unable to evidence you can still operate in the client's best interest because you happen to be remunerated by an insurance methodology in the insurance space, for example. That doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I think you'll probably win a few friends with that one because I think most people are in the same boat. Not really, it doesn't really compute too well.
No,
but it is what it is.
Yeah, it's a very prescriptive process, of course, as to how they disclose all that to their clients. But if it opens up the conversation, I think most fair-minded people realise that doesn't equal conflict.
Yep. Now, you've done a lot of work with the Financial Services Council over the years. Tell us about that.
Yeah, certainly in my time at the banks, I was heavily involved in the advice board at the FSC. So not so since I left ANZ, of course, and moved into Fortnum, but I still remain pretty close to a number of participants on that board today and the work that they're doing. And of course, there's quite a collaborative interaction amongst a number of licensees, where many of us these days now are ex-institutional groups, and we know each other, of course. And there are quite a bit of collaboration that we do in areas that make sense for the collective good of the industry. We're active in input to Treasury or to ASIC or to government, directly to the minister, arguing for things that are just pragmatic, certainly off the thematic of accessibility of advice.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, with the licensing these days, I think a lot of I want to talk about the professional year, and I was sort of thinking about it from a practice point of view. Obviously that $3 million revenue practice with 3 or 4 advisors, great for that professional year candidate to come in. Provides enough structure. What are you doing from the licensee point of view to sort of develop the professional year?
Yeah, so we actually had the first advisor complete their professional year in Fortnum. It was one of our financial planning practices. Came in with a plan that had just started, and we helped facilitate that piece. So, we built the capability to supervise. So there's 2 layers of supervision. Obviously, the framework the practice uses to guide that new person through the process, and then, of course, all the checks and balances that get done by the licensee to assist. So we developed all of that. I think one of the challenges for us, though, is capacity. So it's quite an intensive program of work that a person must undertake. So that necessitates a lot of support at the practice level, and then again an equal measure level of support at the licensee level. The question is, how many of those can you put through the pipe every year? And I think for the moment that's quite limited. And for example, we go out to our network and say, who wants to bring somebody through their professional year? Give us the heads up now so we can kind of map or plan the work effort associated with those candidates over the year. So I think this is a gap the industry's got collectively, is how do we find more efficient ways? Because a lot of that heavy lifting was done by the institutional groups, being people through their salaried networks and so forth, and it's not there any longer. So I think collectively we have some ways to go to solve that as an industry.
Yeah, exactly right. Because literally thousands of people a year could have been coming through the through those banks or that system that now doesn't exist. Yep. And as you mentioned, the pipe is not that wide for the professional year candidates, and we could end up with a shortage of advisors for many years to come with this.
Yeah, well, we've got both sides of that equation, right? So a lot of exiting planners, we've seen those numbers falling off, and there's more to come, of course. And you're right, bottleneck getting people in at the pace. So those larger practices have the capacity to absorb that cost because they'll have the capacity to benefit from the investment. Smaller practice, they struggle with that, right? It's a long time before they get back to right sizing the cost associated with that investment.
Yep. Now tell us about Fortnum. How are you different, and what do you sort of bring to the market?
Look, I think where we're different is we're not distracted about anything. We are an advice license that provides services to independent financial advisors. We think about every day, what is it that advisors need to have at their disposal to be able to leverage a good outcome for their end clients. And in that sense, that's where we remain focused. And I think that's what makes a difference. I think the second thing that's really unique about us is getting the right people together in the room. So a lot of people talk about community, but if you want to be a successful business, then hang out with successful businesses. Now, I like to say we put a lot of effort into making sure we're working with successful businesses, but it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once you get a few of them, more of them come. So I think that's what's unique about us as well is we've got people in a cultural sense that really actively want to engage with each other. And that creates that right type of communities. They're the two, I think, key differentiators. I'll always argue we do all our stuff well, but I think ultimately, being well supported by your peer network as well as the organisation is critical, and an organisation that's not distracted is critical. I think I call it alignment.
Yeah, wonderful. So to talk to me about the future of licensing, I've always had this view, that it could be something that can become extinct over time. Obviously, I think when I think of FSR coming in, I kind of think there was probably an assumption that most advisors would be self-licensed on ASICs or the government's schedule, and it sort of has never happened that way. But is this something, as licensing is something that could become extinct?
I think it could be in its current form, because common sense says the advisor's providing the advice and I'm taking responsibility for it. Well, it's not particularly a sound logical model, right? The question is, how does the advisor take responsibility for it? So what's the gap around governance if you decentralise to that degree? I think that's the thing that's on the mind of Treasury as they look at the future of advice reform. The next phase is that today there is, whether it's considered a desirable, there is a function provided by licensees that interposes between their responsibility and the advisor. That has to be replaced. And it just doesn't go away. We don't have no requirement for compliance because the licensee isn't there. So who takes on that burden and responsibility and ensures it gets discharged properly? So I think we're a ways away from the inevitable, but I do think the inevitable will occur where the licensee structure that we see today will disappear. We don't fear that. Our model is about enabling advice. It's not about adding cost to the process. Those costs exist anyway. I think it just morphs into a different style structure. And then you start to look at, well, what are the other value points that you add as part of the community? In our world, for example, we aggregate considerable value in terms of even product pricing, which is all wholesale, but we negotiate on scale. Well, we can do that. That's 100% pass-through consumer benefit. So there's a lot of other things that licensees or that collective, whatever it ultimately ends up being called, I think add considerable value to.
Yeah, because we're seeing a bit of a trend towards a collective as well for self-license. Even if you're self-licensed, you still join a bit of a collective and be part of a group in some way where this sort of thing can take place.
What I say is that, what's the right scale where you start to optimize? And, even my experience in this business, when you're running a business with, 100 advisors, it's very different. Your options around what you can do are very different to, say, what they are today. So same parallel into a planning practice. There's more you can do when you are bigger, as long as you stay focused on the right things.
Yep, fantastic. Thanks so much for coming on and chatting us to it today, Neil. Tell us about how advisors can reach out or chat to you if they want to continue the conversation.
Sure. Well, obviously you can come to our website, www.fortnum.com.au, or reach out to any member of our team. Obviously myself, you'll find me on LinkedIn or attached to their website, or even talking to people within our business like Rob Skinner, who I think has spoken on your program most recently, heads our practice management function. But no, we're only too happy to help. And so we're not about recruiting advisors for the sake of recruiting. We're actually about finding the right relationships and fits. So if that ends up being the case, then it is.
Fantastic. Thank you, Neil.
All right. Thank you.